The Human Services, Youth, and Early Learning Committee will come to order on this lovely March 21st. We are having a public hearing on 4 bills and not seeing any, now seeing a senator, and get a staff briefing on 5280 from Luke, and welcome Senator Frame, who is virtual.
Thank you, Chair, Senate members of the committee. Luke Wickham, Committee Counsel, and Senate Bill 5280 relates to the duty of clergy to report child abuse or neglect. By way of background, current law requires a number of different individuals to report child abuse and neglect when the person has reasonable cause to believe that a child has suffered abuse or neglect to the proper law enforcement agency or the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. These individuals are often referred to as mandated reporters, and a complete list of those people required to report are included in the bill analysis. Some examples of mandated reporters include physicians, law enforcement officers, school personnel, and nurses, among many others. A mandated reporter who knowingly fails to make a report is guilty of a gross misdemeanor. Senate Bill 5280, which is a companion to House Bill 1098, which was heard and referred out of this committee, requires members of the clergy to report child abuse or neglect when the clergy member has reasonable cause to believe that a child has suffered abuse or neglect, and report that abuse or neglect to the proper law enforcement agency or the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. Members of the clergy are not required to report child abuse or neglect if the information is obtained in the clergy member's professional character as a religious or spiritual advisor when the information is obtained solely through a confession. This bill is identical to the companion that was previously heard in this committee, but does not include the amendments that were adopted by the committee to include the term elder in the definition of member of the clergy, and removing the exception of the mandated reporting requirement for information obtained solely through a confession. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you. Any questions for staff? Seeing none, welcome Senator Frame. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member, and members of the committee. For the record, Noelle Frame, State Senator from the 36th District, reporting live from St. Pete's Hospital in Olympia, where I am spending some quality time with my mother-in-law this afternoon. So thank you for your grace with my appearance. The legislation before you all are, I think, familiar with it at this point, as you had a hearing on the companion bill. But by way of background, in case Rep. Wallen did not share this, this legislation is the product of some really great investigative reporting by Investigative West that reported out on, unfortunately, years of abuse that was covered up by a particular faith community here in Washington State. And in that particular faith community, their church rules dictate that unless they are mandated by law to report abuse, they really have to send it up to sort of the central office rather than reporting it to authorities. And I think Rep. Wallen and I both read that same article and thought that's a problem that we can and should solve and introduce this legislation. I also came to find out my former Representative Mary Lou Dickerson, had spearheaded this legislation 20 years ago and couldn't quite get it across the finish line. And so she is cheering me on this one as well. As I've shared, many of you know from serving with me in these last 7 years in the House that I myself am a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and my parents came to find out about that through by way of a mandated reporter. I was being abused by a member of my own family, a teenage cousin, and really didn't understand what was happening to me and that I could make it stop until a classmate told me that she had told a trusted adult and her abuse had stopped. And that prompted me to tell a trusted adult, namely a teacher, that ultimately resulted in my parents finding out and the abuse stopping. So it's a personally important bill to me. I commend it to you and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so
Madam
much.
Chair.
Any questions for the prime sponsor? Thank you so much for joining us today. Wishing your mother-in-law well.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the grace and flexibility, Madam Chair. Really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you.
Thanks.
And with that, we will suspend the hearing on 5280 and we will suspend the hearing on 5683 and move back up to the top of the agenda to Senate Bill 5280 and ask my Vice Chair to call up the testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have three panels with us here today. If I could get the first panel, Janet Hedgepath, who is remote, and Mitchell Mullen, who is also remote. And on deck, we'll have Cristina de Leon and Bishop Frank Schuster and Eric Niffen. Janet, if you can hear us, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Chair Sen and committee members. My name is Janet Hedgepath. I'm the lobby chair for children's issues for Washington's League of Women Voters. I'm here today in support of SB 5280 with the addition of an amendment to remove the confession exemption. The bill, as amended, would support League's position that the physical and emotional security of a child should be paramount. Removal of the confession exemption clause is necessary to strengthen the bill's ability to protect children and does not preclude the free exercise of one's religion as granted in the First Amendment. We have seen the evidence of the harm caused to children and their families when the knowledge of abuse is kept in confidence in the dark. Children are denied healing and justice while their abusers perpetrate further abuse, again, all in confidence. Washington Constitution grants absolute freedom of conscience in matters of religion, but it explicitly says that it is not to be construed to excuse acts of licentiousness. Conscience includes the ability to act on what we believe. If we believe all children deserve to be protected, then our conscience calls upon all of us to act without exception to provide that protection. Please pass Senate Bill 5280 with amendment removing the confession exemption. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you so much. And I neglected to mention that we had a timer that for 2.5 minutes. So Janet, you were perfectly within that, but just for everybody else who are testifying, just FYI, we have a timer for 2.5 minutes. And also as a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and streamed live. So again, apologize if I didn't mention that before. Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mitchell, you are up next. So if you can hear us, please go ahead. And if I could have Bishop Schuster come up to the desk. Mitchell, whenever you're ready.
Yes, and you can hear me?
Yes.
All right, my name is Mitchell Moline. I'm speaking as a constituent from Ellensburg, Washington. Up until last week, I was recognized as an active member of the Jehovah's Witness organization. I officially resigned as a member, in part due to learning of the policies and decades-long pattern of mishandling allegations of child sexual abuse within that religious community. I was never a victim of CSA, but I am in awe of the brave survivors that have found the courage and strength to speak up about the abuse they experienced. I am ashamed of the faith leaders and adults in these children's lives that should have prevented known child abusers from harming them and others. I commend the Washington state lawmakers that took action and brought forward these bills after reading reports on the gaps our state law has in child safeguarding. I support this bill as it will do much to close these gaps. However, I urge you to reconsider keeping the confession exemption, or loophole as it more accurately should be described. It is important to recognize how the Watchtower Corporation, the governing authority over Jehovah's Witnesses, and similarly insular faith communities use these confession loopholes to excuse themselves and their elders from reporting predators in their congregations. The policies that Watchtower lawyers continue to argue in courts is that any and all communications a congregant has with an elder fall under clergy penitent privilege. This means that even a child reporting their abuser is to be viewed as part of that official confession process. And in fact, it has been understood in some cases that a child would be viewed as reporting their own sin of being abused. When a victim of CSA makes an allegation against another member of the faith community, this starts an internal investigation by the elders. They make detailed notes and fill out official forms with details of the abuse, and often, after confronting the abuser, obtain a confession of the crimes. These forms have been described by some law enforcement and legal experts as if they were detailed police reports. This information, the Watchtower organization will fight in courts to withhold from those seeking to justice for the victim. The policies and practices continue to demonstrate their priority of placing brand, image, and even rights of predators above the protection of children within the faith community, and also does nothing to protect children outside the community. These organizations need to be forced to alert the proper authorities to dangerous predators. Please do what you can to correct these gaps in our law and make Washington State a leader in protecting children from predators within faith communities. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mitchell. Appreciate you joining us today. Thank you. And with that, Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our next panel, if we can start with Bishop Schuster, and then we'll have Eric, and then Christina. Welcome. Please go ahead whenever you're ready.
Well, good afternoon, Chair Sen, Ranking Member Eslick, and committee members. I'm Bishop Frank Schuster, and I'm speaking on behalf of 5 Catholic bishops who shepherd 1 million Catholics in our state. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I urge you to pass 5280 as proposed, with no changes to eliminate or undermine the clergy penitent privilege, which has long existed under state law. The Catholic Church acknowledges the wrongful acts of abuse that have occurred to children under our watch. It's imperative that we continue to work so that needed healing and restoration from these offenses can be realized by these individuals. The Catholic bishops of Washington also want to convey that we support the clergy reporting components of the underlying bill, because we already consider clergy to be mandatory reporters at all times in every setting, with one critical exception during the sacrament of reconciliation, also known as confession. So let me explain. When the priest celebrates the sacrament of reconciliation, the priest is fulfilling the ministry of the Good Shepherd who seeks the lost sheep. Jesus commanded his apostles and their successors to do so because the forgiveness of sins is necessary for salvation. The seriousness of this sacrament prohibits priests from disclosing anything said in the confessional. If they do so, they're excommunicated. This penalty is enforced so that Catholics can confess their sins without fear. Preserving the seal in the confessional does not prevent a priest from promoting justice. In fact, a confession is an opportunity to tell offenders to turn themselves in as a matter of restitution. It may interest you that in response to our tragic history of abuse in the past, the Catholic Church in the U.S. established a charter for the protection of children and young people in 2002, also known as the Dallas Charter. It is a comprehensive set of procedures for addressing allegations of sexual abuse of minors, includes provisions for accountability, prevention of future acts, healing and reconciliation. An outside consulting firm also collects data and performs on-site audits of dioceses and parishes. Our church today continues to do all we can to ensure that our schools, parishes, and ministries are safe places for our children, their families, and everybody. In conclusion, it's been stated with no factual support that an attack on the clergy penitent privilege is necessary to make this bill stronger. On the contrary, any such amendment will accomplish nothing and will only serve to undermine the freedom of religion. To be clear, over history, priests have been martyred and imprisoned for refusing to break the seal of the confessional. For love of our people, we would never do it. So for your part, any attempt to harm the privacy and confidentiality of this sacrament would harm the very souls the public servants vow to protect. So please respect the constitutional right of Catholics in our state to come to confession and unburden their hearts without fear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you would be willing to take a question or two?
Yeah, sure. Happy.
Thank you. Representative Couture.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Bishop. You mentioned the charter and how some of the priests in your organization already consider yourselves mandatory reporters.
Yeah.
Have there been instances where priests in your organization had to report child abuse to the authorities?
Well, certainly. In fact, I can share with you that I am a priest that did that. Something came during a pastoral counseling situation that I knew I needed to report, and I did. I filed a police report, and I dare say we saved a child that day. And I know other priests have done the same thing. You know, talking to Human Resources, Matt Boswell at the Archdiocese, he'll tell you that he's told a number of priests to report. So yes, we take that very seriously. Our whole safe environment program, training, and everything's available for you to review at archseattle.org. So this is something that we do.
Follow-up, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To your knowledge, is there any other state that does this, what might be proposed to do with the amendment as we passed it, or as we passed out of committee in the House, eliminating the confession piece?
Oh, to be honest with you, thanks for the question. I've been a bishop for like 9 months, and so I'm still a baby bishop, as we call ourselves, and so I'm still trying to. So I'm not aware of. I've only been to a couple of the meetings and all the rest, so I'm not aware of what's going on other places. But I'm a pretty good resource for here in the Archdiocese of Seattle and also here in the state of Washington. So.
Thank you, Bishop. Representative Ortiz-Health?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hello, Bishop. So help me understand. I think I might be misunderstanding. So on one hand, I think I heard that the priests are already mandatory reporters,
Yes.
but legally they're not.
Outside of the confession, yeah, we're mandatory reporters.
So outside of the confession, you're mandatory reporter. You want to keep the confession separate from the outside of the confession.
Yes,
Okay, now I
yeah.
understand what you're saying. So when you made the report, it wasn't something you received in confession.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. It was in a pastoral setting, but we needed to take action.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
No, thank you for the question.
Yeah, and just to clarify with staff on that, I'm guessing that in Washington State, legally, they're not mandatory reporters, or we wouldn't need this bill. But it sounds like you guys have a policy of that.
Our policy is
Right,
that,
right.
all clergy, not only clergy, but our volunteers even, anybody who has contact with youth and vulnerable populations, we consider them mandatory reporters. Yeah.
Wonderful, yeah. Thank you. Just wanted to clarify. Representative Walsh?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome, Father. In our discussion of the House version of this, which we considered some time ago, we discussed a bit about the chilling effect that breaking the seal would have, and that by breaking the seal in confession, we might work against the public's interest in bringing perpetrators out into the public. Do you think that chilling effect is a likely outcome?
Oh, absolutely.
And expand on that, how it would affect the likelihood of bringing a wrongdoer into the light.
Well, so in terms of confession, people, when they go to confession, they're carrying with them a lot of grief, a lot of hurt. Sometimes it's just sort of the normal stuff, like, okay, I might have said a bad word to a spouse or something like that. But, there's people come in and you find out as a confessor that, people aren't as happy as they seem. That they carry with them a lot of burdens, and they need some place to be able to share that, their guilt, their hurt, in a way that they know it's not going to be shared anyplace else. And it's something that Jesus commanded his disciples to do. It's one of our 7 sacraments of the church, and it's liberating. It says a priest, when someone comes in, and they pour it all out. And then I'm able to give them the love of Jesus, and I'm able to share the mercy of Jesus with them. And it's a liberating moment, and it's beautiful, and that's why I'm a priest. That's why I did it, to be able to share God's grace in that way. It only works if people know that they can go in and without fear and be able to share the deepest recesses of their hearts, so that we're able to forgive them. It doesn't work if they come in and with fear that somehow what they're saying, could end up being come to light. And so it's hard to describe the Catholic, imagination, but it's one of our 7 sacraments of the church. It's very important for us to be able to share that sacrament of reconciliation that Christ commanded us to do as part of our religion. Makes sense? And so, yeah, there would be a chilling effect.
Thank you. If you're willing to continue with the
Yeah,
questions, thank you. Representative Eslick?
Thank you, Chair Sen. First of all, Bishop, thank you so much for being here today.
Happy to be here.
This
Thank
is,
you.
I'm sorry you weren't here when the first bill came around. You would have been able to answer a lot of these questions. I grew up in the parochial school, and so I get confession. The question I have is, if you were to hear this in confessional, is it policy, or is it love of your fellow man that you might talk to that person outside of confession about the issue?
Yeah, priests do. They encourage very strongly that they talk to them outside of confession. so that then they can become mandatory reporters and are able to, and also to encourage, counseling, that kind of thing. I tell people, if they broke a crime, if they committed a crime, they need to turn themselves in as part of restitution. I'm clear with that. And, the reality is that it's behind the screen. People with that kind of thing, they won't even go face to face, so it'll be, I won't know who they are anyway, but, they'll hear my voice, telling them to, make this right. And so turning themselves in. So does that help?
Actually not, but
Okay,
but,
all right.
but the fact that you were, I'm sorry, follow up. Sorry. The fact that in the confessional you will ask them to do these things that they need to do, because you don't see who they are, then you don't see them afterwards outside a confessional.
Unless they come to me.
Unless they come to you.
Yeah, yeah.
How often does that happen?
Oh, this kind of grave sin, breaking a crime, in the last 23 years, just a handful of times, 2, maybe 3. I mean, most people are, coming in and they're confessing just, that normal hurt and pain that people experience, broken relationships, that sort of thing, that they want God's grace. It's more things of that nature. I'm here for you. I'll set up shop.
Affleck needs a screen, I think.
In fact, my first confession was actually a drive-through kind of experience. Yeah, I was just a young priest. I was in Chicago, and someone came up in a Chevy. The window went down, and they asked me, "Can you hear my confession?" I said, "Okay," and I did it. And afterwards, they said, "Thank you." The window went up, and they sped off. And I said, "My first confession's a drive-through confession. This is amazing." They felt better. I mean, the car just kind of leapt along. I'm sorry, I'm teasing. I shouldn't make light of it. But yeah, no, it's a very serious sacrament. And there's times when people come in and their hearts are breaking. They're aching. They're just aching. And to be able to share the love of Jesus, that's what it's really about. That's when we're at our best. Yeah.
Thank you. Representative Taylor?
Hate to be the Debbie Downer here.
Oh, no, fine.
Are there instances where someone is making a confession and is continuing to harm the child, that it's clear that this is an ongoing pattern of abuse that they are engaged in? It's not, oh, I did this 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 1 year ago, and the behavior has stopped and they're confessing now. I can imagine that there's a lot of people who are coming to you as a priest to confess, and they, even with the confession, they need to be held accountable because they're continuing to harm the child. You have no obligation to do anything.
Well, I thank you for the question. Just refer back to my experience. I can talk about me in terms of my experience as a confessor.
You're a leader.
Yeah, I am a leader.
You
so
mentor other priests,
absolutely,
right?
yeah, and I'll tell you what we tell them. But in terms of me, there's only been like a couple times in the last 23 years. It's been behind the screen, and so I don't know who they are, but I tell them, to turn themselves in. It's. And in terms of what we tell priests is that we encourage them to tell each person who comes in with that kind of a thing to talk to them after confession, seek counseling. Particularly important when we can't see them on the other side of the screen. Some people just don't come in front of you. And so we want them to come talk to us outside of confession, so then we're mandatory reporters at that point, or if they go to a counselor, then they're in the presence of a mandatory reporter at that point. That's the best I can answer that.
Follow-up, Representative?
I mean, that's what you do, but that's not necessarily policy. My question is, given that your experience with this is very limited, even within your own faith, how does this apply in other faiths where the confession is not anonymous or is used and abused on a regular basis, where there's a reason why we're here?
Sure, I hear you. I'm not knowledgeable of other faith traditions. I'm a Catholic, born and raised, and so I don't have much interactions with other faith. It'd be an interesting question to ask them. Yeah.
Thank you. Representative Dent, and then Ortiz Self, and then we're going to move on to the remaining testifiers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we passed it, let's say we passed it, the governor signs it, so it becomes law, and we do those things, but sometimes the general public doesn't necessarily have a real, they don't pinpoint on what we've just done, they just generalize it. So my concern would be we do this, and I just want your honest opinion because I'm kind of sitting on the edge here.
I hear you.
If we do this, it doesn't mean that the average person walking down the street is going to totally understand that they can still come to confession, without jeopardizing something, okay? So do you think that this could perhaps stop someone from coming to confession because they don't understand what we've done here and don't understand what the law might be? Or do you see an avenue for you to maybe communicate those things to the people in the Catholic Church?
Well, sure. I'd go back to maybe that second to the last point. That over the history, priests have been martyred and imprisoned for refusing to break the seal of the confessional, and for love of our people, we won't do it. People actually, we talk about. You might be thinking in terms of a priest's right to the seal. No, this is the right to the seal of the confessional is for the 1 million Catholics in the state. They have the right to the seal of the confession, so that they're able to come and confess their sins, unburden their, whatever's weighing heavy on their heart, and receive the loving forgiveness of Jesus without fear of the government, subpoenaing the priest. So that's what we're talking about. Yeah.
Thank you. Representative Ortiz, last question.
Following up with some of the line, I'm trying to reconcile the love for the child and the love for the person, the child that's being damaged. Do you, and you mentioned freedom of religion. Do you feel then that all religions should have the right to not report child sexual abuse or malnutrition or physical abuse? I mean, should this just apply to priests, or should it apply to every religion?
We see ourselves as mandatory reporters in every single arena other than the confessional. In terms of other religions, maybe the Washington State Catholic Conference representatives, have more to say about that. I'm a Catholic bishop. I'm a Catholic pastor, so I can't really speak.
Well, no, I just mentioned because you mentioned freedom of religion.
We expect any of our employees, volunteers, to be mandatory reporters. That is our policy, and so and we do a lot of good, particularly with our Safe Environment program. Ever since 2002, it's been an earthquake for the church. And so we've done our every effort to up our game and be leaders in this effort. And so I can't speak to other faiths. I'm the bishop of the Catholic Church. So
thanks very much, Bishop, for joining us.
No, thanks for this opportunity, and God bless you. And I'll set up shop right up.
Thank you.
Anyway, bless you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much. Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If we could have Eric up next, and then right after we'll have Christina. Eric, whenever you are ready, please go ahead. And again, you have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Eric Niffen. I'm here today as a fellow with the Ethics and Public Policy Center, a think tank in Washington, D.C. I'm also a civil rights lawyer. SB 5280 is a good bill, but it would be a mistake to amend the bill and try to force priests to tell the state what people say in confession. Based on recent conversations, I'm concerned that members of this committee might not adequately understand the mandatory reporter law as it stands today, as well as the practical and legal effects of trying to require clergy to violate their religious vows. First, the mandatory reporter law already recognizes a lot of privileges that have been called somewhat loopholes by some people. RCW 244430B incorporates RCW 56060 into the state's mandatory reporting law, taking rules about testimony in court and using them to limit people's obligations as mandatory reporters. This committee should understand how broad these exceptions are before it takes steps to intrude on the sacrament of the Catholic Church. Second, it's important to understand why our Constitution and laws recognize privileges. According to the Washington Supreme Court, because some relationships are deemed so important cannot be effective without candid communication, courts and legislatures have granted them privilege. specifically citing the attorney-client and clergy-penitent privileges. Finally, these first 2 points show why amending the bill as discussed would be unconstitutional. One test courts use to see whether a restriction on religion is constitutional is to see whether the government is equally zealous in restricting similar secular activities. For example, prison safety is really important, but if the prison will allow beards for medical reasons, it has to make exceptions for religious beards too. And the same is true here. Government can't say it's good for lawyers to keep confession secret for secular reasons, but it's illegal for priests to keep confession secret for religious reasons. That's why no court has ever approved government invasion of the sacrament of confession. Before this committee votes on Friday, I challenge you to cite examples. When has the seal of the confessional delayed or blocked Washington from knowing about child abuse? Similarly, why would you attack this religious privilege while leaving secular privileges intact? For more information, please see the public comment that I submitted on February the 24th. I would also be happy to answer questions, to participate in a working session, or speak to any of you individually. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Representative Walsh.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to ask you a variation of the same question I asked the bishop. My interest in a potential chilling effect of breaking the seal of confession is not spiritual. It's worldly. I'm concerned that by breaking the seal, we discourage wrongdoers from fessing up first to themselves and their confessor and eventually to the public what they've done. Do you have any thoughts on how breaking the seal would put a chilling effect not only into a person's spiritual redemption, but into their process for going public with their wrongdoing?
Sure. I think the bishop is better to speak to this than I. I listen to priests and bishops, and so I receive from them like their thoughts on this. I think it's true that sin and really evil deeds hide in the dark, and being able to just say out loud what you did is a really important first step. And I think that's one of the reasons why having a safe place like the confessional is so important. And like the bishop said, Catholic priests and bishops are trained these days to say, look, this is a really important thing. You've taken a big step in saying these words out loud, but we need to make this right. I would like you to come see me after the confessional, and let's talk together about what we need to do in order to make this right. So having an absolutely safe place where you can unburden your soul and says, I did this, is a big step towards recognizing, it is in some sense recognizing, I have to do something to make this right. I can't live the way I have been.
Thank you. Eric, is your center affiliated with the Catholic Church?
No.
In no way?
No. It's, you can look up on the website if you'd like, but it's an unaffiliated nonprofit think tank.
Representative Couture.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When we heard the House bill version of this and the amendment in committee, it was my understanding, and I believe staff said this as well, that the amendment didn't change the existing RCW with clergy penitent privilege, but now we're hearing that it does. So maybe I'm a little confused there. Has any other state did what we proposed previously to do in the House with the amended version that we might consider doing on Friday? It doesn't.
I'm going to start with the first part. There are two really good questions. I'm going to start with the first one. So all these citations, I get sort of tripped up. So RCW 56060 is a testimonial privilege. And so the way that provision is written, it is about who cannot be forced to testify in court. So that itself on its own terms is limited, but the mandatory reporting law incorporates that. And the law does this a lot. It'll say, okay, this standard that we had developed over here for this purpose, we're now going to use over here for a different purpose. And that's what the mandatory reporting law does, is it cites that testimonial privilege, and it says that information that was received in a privileged communication under that other statute will not make someone a mandatory reporter here.
And this might be a question for staff. Luke, if you can follow up and maybe talk a little about 26.44.030 or other components of the pendant privilege and to represent Couture's question and about other states.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about other states as well. I just wanted to take that first part on first.
Sorry,
if you look, if you do look at that testimonial privilege, this is what I was talking to in my testimony about secular privileges. The attorney-client privilege is the one that the Supreme Court of the United States and the Washington Supreme Court says really is the one that is on par with the priest-penitent relationship. But the Washington State privilege communication, there's a lot in there for domestic violence counselors, for sexual abuse counselors, for even Alcohol Anonymous sponsors. There's privileges in that statute, and so you already have whether it's the Investigation West or whatever it is saying that there's this loophole out there. You all have tons of loopholes, and you need to understand that because that is really important to the legal effect of trying to close off this so-called loophole for priests. If you have secular loopholes, that's going to be really important legally.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric.
Now you had your
Luke,
question
sorry,
about
Eric,
other states.
Sorry, yeah, we're going to ask staff just so we make sure that we're getting factual information on that. Luke, can you just share what you know about this?
So just to circle back, there are certain professions that are identified as required to report child abuse and neglect. There's a separate statute that creates, as Eric indicated, a testimonial privilege, so a prohibition on testifying in a court or being compelled to produce information that would be introduced in a court hearing. And so those are separate statutes, separate requirements. One is a requirement to report that something happened, and one is a prohibition on that person being required to testify and describe that information during a court proceeding. And there is some interrelationship between those two, but there are also some individuals who are identified as mandated reporters who also are privileged in their the information they're required to produce for a court hearing. So doctors, for example, spouses, for example, are a doctor is someone who is required to report child abuse and neglect, but also any information between that doctor and their patient is privileged as it relates to being required to produce that information during a court proceeding. So there's been a lot of information back and forth. Maybe I don't know if that was addressing the question, but I'm happy to follow up.
No, thank you for that.
Representative Couture, do you have a question for staff?
Yes, please. Thank you, Madam Chair. So yes, that does clear it up, that part up a bit. I guess what I'm really concerned about is, we have this bill now, we amend it, and are we running afoul constitutionally to where this thing's going to get struck down? And that's why I'm asking what other states do this, because I've heard anywhere from 0 and I've heard up to 12. And I'm not getting the right information, because if what we're about to do is just going to get struck down later, this is a massive waste of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Luke, on the state question, do you know of any information about other states?
A few documents indicating that there was a 2015 document put out by the Children's Bureau of the United States indicating that there were 3 other locations within the United States that had required reporting of child abuse and neglect by clergy and not exempted the confessional information. So Guam, West Virginia, and New Hampshire. I haven't verified that myself, but that is a document that I saw. Looking back at our own state statute, it looks like clergy were required to report here in Washington until 1975. And it appears that there was no confessional exemption here at that time, but I can't answer the question about whether the the bill as amended by the House would be struck down. I think there could be a challenge, but I don't quite know how that would be resolved.
Thank you for
Follow-up,
your
Representative Couture?
No follow-up. Thank you for your indulgence, and
Sure.
thank you,
It's good
Luke.
information, great questions.
And Eric, thank you too.
Any additional questions for Eric? Representative Taylor?
In terms of mandatory reporting, we heard testimony today that mandatory reporting could be to police, but could there be other entities that mandatory reporting could be made to, such as CPS?
Yeah, it's law enforcement or the Department of Children, Youth, and Families.
And is it possible, Madam Chair?
Follow-up, thank you.
And is it possible to make a report anonymously?
It is.
Thank you. Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your testimony, Eric. Next up, we're going to have Cristina de Leon. Cristina, whenever you are ready, you have 2.5 minutes. Please introduce yourself to the committee and go ahead when you're ready.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Cristiana De Leon, also happy to answer questions. I'm a Black Diamond resident and a board member for the Association of Secular Elected Officials. ASCO is a nonprofit that is an extension of what it means for people in government to do the right thing for the right thing's sake, guided by experience, community, compassion, and reason. We are about crafting laws and policies that step in where our individual and social flaws fail us. That's why I'm testifying as other today on this bill, because there is nothing sacred about providing safe harbor for child abuse. To know abuse and to do nothing is to condone that abuse. We must pass this bill, but if and only if we amend the bill to close the loophole, and it is a loophole, allowing abuse to continue to fester under the guise of exemptions for confessionals and similar religious activities. I thank the representatives, including and particularly Representative Taylor, who worked to close this gap and dangerous loophole in the companion bill. We must thoroughly demonstrate that there are no exceptions to protecting our youth. If we do not get this bill right the first time, we will be signaling that we are okay with certain times when we can provide cover for abuse that carries a lifetime of trauma. We're hearing so much about people coming with heavy hearts. Now imagine it's children. Washington State will be failing in our duty as elected representatives for all Washingtonians, including but not limited to children who had no say in the religious practices of their caretakers, and certainly not in the abuse by the people who they were supposed to trust the most. We heard testimony of people who grew up wishing that more had been done, including by their church, when they were being abused. We need to listen to these impacted people. There are already 13 states, including West Virginia, with laws on the books that demonstrate that adding this condition of no exceptions, including of penitent clergy privilege, is still aligned with First Amendment religious rights, to say nothing of how no exceptions to mandated reporting is clearly in line with a child's basic right to safety. There are, however, plenty of states that have stories of horrific if-onlys in the news, most notably this past year, one in Kansas, that involved a cover-up of abuse that included 188 clergy members. The result required a much more heavy-handed approach from a, mind you, conservative attorney general. This could have been avoided far more proactively had the right laws been in place. Let's be more proactive and join the states who value the true safety of children in their adults' care. Let's not wait until we have a shameful legacy to address. Please pass SB 5280, but we should only move forward with the exemptions language being removed. Thank you, and again, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much. Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Next up, we're going to have Mark O'Donnell, and on deck we'll have Christopher Marino Harden. Mark, whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
They're still transferring over right now, Mr. Vice Chair, but okay, we have Christopher in the Zoom room right now.
Great, we can get started with Christopher. Christopher, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My full name is Christopher Marino Harden. I usually go by Marino. I am currently a Seattle resident, but I spent most of my life in Spokane, as well as my entire life as a member of Jehovah's Witnesses. I was not an abuse victim myself, but I was a whistleblower in the Investigate West investigation, and I've been asked by several abuse victims and their families to speak up on their behalf, as well as some who are, and many of these are concerned about repercussions from the Watchtower organization, which I will likely face myself for my appearance here. I'm very supportive of this bill. We know from many case examples in many states and countries that clergy mandatory reporting has positive effects, just like it has for doctors, for teachers, and for therapists. It's not a restriction on clergy. It acknowledges an elevated position of trust over children, and it resolves moral and ethical issues that can lead to the bystander effect. I think this bill is good for everyone and may have prevented many of the abuses that I've witnessed. Any bill is better than no bill, but I'm really concerned about the paragraph dealing with clergy penitent privilege. I believe that it undermines the purpose of the entire bill. If the concept of mandatory reporting is to eliminate the bystander effect, then I believe that this exemption codifies the bystander effect. The wording of the bill exempts the reporting of any confession that a clergy member is required to keep secret under their doctrine, discipline, tenets, or customs. In this example, Jehovah's Witnesses customs, and according to their written rule book that elders must follow, all internal investigations are to include a panel questioning with multiple clergy members to be recorded in writing, sent to the branch, and kept secret. This broad wording lets any religious organization adjust their policies to require that all investigations be kept secret as part of their tenets and customs. Confession from the perpetrator, third party, request for help from the victim, a panel interrogation, all of these in Jehovah's Witnesses or Scientology can be couched as a confession, and now the victims cannot subpoena the documents to make their case in court. Eric Niffen before me gave testimony that frustrated me. He asked for a challenge. He asked to see an example of a case where the state was not able to get information because of a confessional privilege. I can give you multiple. This strategy is commonplace for several churches. Kakert versus Watchtower in Montana last week had this problem, and they denied subpoenas for the documents that had full confessions in them. Eric also avoided answering the question from Rep. Couture about whether other states have introduced this amendment. There's at least 6 others, including Texas, that explicitly disallow clergy penitent privilege as grounds for failing to report child sexual abuse. New Hampshire, South Carolina, Oklahoma, Rhode Island, West Virginia, Guam, and Texas. Australia, the UK, and several other organizations have commissioned independent studies and all concluded that no exemptions was the best policy. The bishop who spoke before me invoked history of priests being martyred and imprisoned, but when we look at this history, when we look at bills that exist, we're not seeing mass arrests of priests. These concerns are hypothetical and do not reflect reality. I respect the steps the Catholic Church has taken to improve their standards, but I fear they're asking the bill to be weakened, and I yield my time. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Marino. We do have some questions. Representative Taylor.
Thank you, Marino. What happens when a person goes to a clergy and confesses that they've been victimized by a third party? Is the clergy then still prohibited from reporting?
Yes, so in the Jehovah's Witnesses, there is a guidebook that gives them instructions, and the instruction specifically just says to call the branch for further instructions. There is no explicit prohibition from them reporting it, but there is also no requirement that they report. And there is a culture of not exposing things that puts the church in a bad light. So it is incredibly rare that a person will go ahead and do that on their own volition. Mark O'Donnell, who is following me, is actually a former elder and can likely speak to that better. But the policy is that of secrecy and calling the branch for further instruction.
Follow-up, Representative Taylor.
Thank you. So the exact opposite situation could happen where a victim has a chilling effect around reporting abuse that they're experiencing, knowing full well that the clergy won't do anything, including a person who is part of the congregation where they have control, power, and resources to ostracize or do whatever their process is with that individual. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, I'd say that's a great way of explaining it. And there is definitely a chilling effect already in place. There's a lot of cultural and written policies that punish members who speak out against the church. It is an offense that can be punished with shunning to speak against the church in public. So because of that culture and knowing that they may be punished because the church has a no tolerance rule essentially on sex outside of marriage. So frequently a minor may be punished the same as an abuser for having sex with an adult. In fact, one of my friends who I shunned for many years as a believing Jehovah's Witness, I shunned her because she was removed for that reason, and she was a 14-year-old. This happens a lot. So the victim fears confessing because they may be punished.
Thank you, Marino. And trying to form this into a question. So what you are sharing are actual instances of this happening versus hypothetical concerns that others have expressed that this may happen, and it sounds like you have that there's specific instances where this has happened. This is not theory in the religion that you're familiar with and affiliated with, or formerly affiliated with. Is that accurate?
Yes, I could provide you with multiple examples within Washington State, within Spokane alone, at least a half dozen to a dozen, depending on how you define the parameters. So this has happened here multiple times, and this was just within my community. And we have very well documented cases of this happening nationally, and multiple court cases around the country where the states that have this privilege allow the priest to abuse it because they can simply claim everything is privileged, and without access to that information, without access to their written investigations where they questioned the perpetrator and the victim in a panel of at least 3 men. They have that all in writing, but the court cannot summon that, and they cannot prove that it should not be privileged because they can't get access to it.
Thank you very much. Any additional questions? Representative Walsh.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to be clear, your experience is limited to the Jehovah's Witness Church, correct?
Yes, my experience is limited to the Jehovah's Witness Church, and I know Scientology and a few other religions have very similar policies, and so I respect that the Catholic Church has taken great internal steps to improve their standards, but my concern is that they're trying to weaken the bill, which will affect religions who have not taken the great steps that they have taken. And so that is the reason that I feel we need to target the lowest common denominator and have a consistent law. At the very least, it should be amended to dramatically reduce the scope of what counts as privileged. But I think that we have proof from Australia and the UK studies and multiple other states' examples that the policy works best when there are no exceptions.
Thank you. Follow-up?
And just to follow up, while you have opinions about the Catholic Church and Scientology, your only direct experience is with Jehovah's Witnesses, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Thank you very much for coming forward, especially even with your concerns, your own peril. Appreciate it. Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our last testifier today is going to be Mark O'Donnell. Mark, if you could hear us, please go ahead.
I think you're on mute. Oh, there you go.
Okay, are we unmuted?
Yes, please go ahead. Yep.
Okay, good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Mark O'Donnell. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm here representing myself. I'm an advocate for survivors of child sexual abuse and reporter of criminal and civil child sexual abuse cases within the Jehovah's Witness Church. I'm here today to support Senate Bill 5280, but with comment. Children must be protected by the authority figures in their lives. Church elders and ministers are their authority figures. 2 days ago, I was contacted by a woman from Washington State who disclosed that she obtained internal documents from the Jehovah's Witness Church detailing the barbaric rape of a 4-year-old child that took place hundreds of times. Jehovah's Witness church elders are instructed by their legal department in New York not to report such crimes to the police, particularly in states where clergy-mandated reporting does not exist. They maintain a permanent database of these crimes, which is inaccessible to law enforcement. Although I support this bill, I would like to challenge the legislature to remove the exception for confessions made to members of the clergy. While I respect the desire of persons of faith to confide in spiritual leaders, the safety of our children far outweighs the confidentiality of a confession. Churches can defend themselves, children can't. Such exceptions serve only the interest of the abuser and the church, not the victims. We cannot permit a chilling effect on law enforcement. In 2006, Jehovah's Witness elders in Crystal Lake, Illinois, extracted a confession from an abuser who was molesting his 6-year-old daughter. The law said they must report. But because of the exception for confessions, they were told not to report. As a result, the victim was raped for 12 more years until she finally came forward at age 19, on her 19th birthday. Her father was immediately arrested and sentenced to a 50-year prison term. 1 year ago this week, The elders involved in that case who didn't report were found guilty of violating the Mandatory Reporting Act. And in his verdict, on March 18th, Judge Mark Gerhardt said that while the state cannot define one's religion, I still agree that religion cannot define the state's statute. I urge Washington to pass this law, but to remove the loophole that will radically weaken this bill. So I want to thank everyone, and I'm available for questions.
Thanks, Mark. Any questions? Representative Taylor.
I don't know if you're able to answer this question, but I did hear in previous testimony about practices and efforts that loop in other activities into the banner of confession within the Jehovah's Witness and other religious orders. What's to keep religious orders from redefining their activities to be under the confession
Nothing.
process?
You're asking a very, very important question. In fact, when I met with prosecutors in Illinois for the trial of these two elders who did not report, one of the things they said to me is that the way that these laws are constructed is that anyone can create a religion and start that religion, get a 501c3 tax exemption as a religious organization, and they can just make up their own rules as they go. They can claim that anything is a confession. So the problem with the law that we see it now is that while you do have this added language that says in your new proposed law that says only confessions are exempt, I think your law is written in such a way that it says that if it's negative in nature or something outside of the confession, then that would not be included in the exemption. But so the problem is that with the Jehovah's Witness Church, the Mormon Church, and other churches, which I have examined extensively, what they will do is classify anything they desire as a confession. So if they hear, for example, a confession from someone, they can launch an investigation, and outside of that confessional, they can say, well, what you've told us or what we've heard is part of our confessional arrangement. It's part of our accepted church practice. So this is the problem we have, and I agree with Mrs. De Leon in her position on this, that it creates too much of a problem when you add this confessional exception to the law. So you're correct.
Thank you. Follow up, Representative Taylor.
So in short, you're essentially saying we need a bright line rule that applies across the board to narrow how folks are defining what a confession is for this purpose, for mandatory reporting. Very narrow purpose.
Yeah, it's just extremely difficult to manage all of this. And I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that children are our first priority. A church can always defend itself in a civil or criminal court. Priests can get lawyers, elders can get lawyers, but a child, a vulnerable child, cannot. And I think it was mentioned earlier by someone else that, within the Jehovah's Witness Church, even victims are held accountable for having sex with an adult. And all of that is kept confidential. They can be disciplined by the church, but I know that's not the subject of why we're here today. But it's a very slippery slope, and it's a very dangerous thing to allow any organization to conceal the information, documents, anything that deals with child sexual abuse. As I mentioned earlier, millions of documents have been collected and stored in a large, both legal and spiritual database among the Jehovah's Witnesses, particularly in Washington State, where there has never been a broad-scale clergy reporting law. So the number of cases that are likely to come forward are significant. This information should not be concealed from law enforcement, but it should be revealed to law enforcement.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mark. Mr. Vice Chair, are there any others wishing to testify?
No other testifiers, Madam Chair.
Thank you, everybody. And with that, we'll close the hearing on Senate Bill 5280. And